Okay folks, we're going to look at investigating an ecosystem, and we're going to look at abiotic factors. Now, abiotic factors are non-living factors that affect organisms living in an ecosystem and their distribution. For example, temperature, moisture, light intensity, pH, and natural disasters. So abiotic factors are non-living factors affecting the distribution of living organisms. Now what we can look at is wood lice. So we can look at the distribution and how their distribution is affected by an abiotic factor. So we're looking here at a choice chamber, and it gives the wood lice a choice between light area or dry area, and in this example, dry or wet. So you put the wood lice into the choice chamber, and what you do is you track their movement. Now, wood lice prefer moist conditions. They prefer moist conditions because they have permeable membranes that lose water, and if they're in dry conditions, they'll lose the water and they'll dry out. Now, what we find when we look at the behaviour of wood lice is that if they're placed in an area that they don't like, for example, dry area, you find they'll move very quickly and they'll move towards the wet regions. If they're in the wet regions, they will stay there. They'll move slowly. And this is for survival reasons because wood lice will dry out if not in a moist area. So if given the choice between a light or dark area, the wood lice would respond by moving towards the dark area. Now the reason for that is they want to avoid predators. So if they find themselves in the light, what happens is you will see when you look at their behaviour, they will start moving quickly in an attempt to get out of the light and into the dark. And again, this is of survival value to the wood lice as they are hidden from predators. So, if given the choice between a damp or a dry area, wood lice respond by moving towards a damp area. If wood lice find themselves in the dry area, they move quickly to escape the dry area. This is of survival value to the wood lice as their membranes are permeable and so they lose water very easily. So, abiotic biotic. Write notes on both biotic and abiotic factors which could affect the distribution of organisms in an ecosystem. So you might want to say biotic factors are factors relating to living organisms or living things rather, such as food availability, predators, competition for space and mates, disease. Abiotic factors, on the other hand, are non-living factors, for example, temperature, moisture, light intensity, and pH. Past paper practice, National 4 and National 5 biotic. So copy and complete the table below, putting in the relevant biotic factors to the left-hand side column and the abiotic factors to the right-hand side column. So for biotic, these are living factors. So we might have disease. You might have number of predators. Because disease is living, caused by living organisms like viruses and bacteria, and predators are caused by living organisms. You might also have amount of food. So the abiotic, that's the non-living factor, so you might have light, temperature, moisture, and space. So abiotic is non-living. And biotic is living. Think biology, biotic. B for biology, which is about living things. So an investigation to demonstrate the response of woodlice to light was carried out in a choice chamber. Half of the choice chamber was covered in black paper and the other half left in light. 10 woodlice were introduced into the choice chamber. The number of woodlice in each side was counted every 2 minutes for 10 minutes. So, the first question is, name 2 environmental conditions which must be kept the same in order for this to be valid. So we've got to identify what is our independent variable. What were we investigating? What were we changing? So we should have light and dark. That is your independent variable. That's what you're changing. So everything else must be kept the same. So what have they given us that we can't see? They've given us a number of woodlice. But that's it. So what else could we say that we'd need to keep the same? So you might want to say moisture, maybe temperature. What conclusion can be drawn from the results of this investigation? So again, what we have to do is look at our aim. An investigation to demonstrate the response of woodlice to light. That was your investigation. The response of woodlice to light. So that has to be in your conclusion. You need to talk about how the woodlice responded to light. So let's look at the results to find out. So number in light area, what happened over your 10 minutes? We started off with 6, then we got to 3, and then by 10 minutes there was none left. So what was the response of woodlice to light? They moved away from the light. And finally, explain the advantage of this behaviour to the woodlice. Protect from predators. Okay, an investigation was carried out into the effect of temperature on the germination of grass seeds. 5 identical petri dishes, each containing 20 seeds, were set up as shown in the diagram. Each dish was left in the dark at a different temperature. After 7 days, the percentage germination in each dish was calculated. The results are shown in the table below. So again, what is our independent variable? What are we investigating here? And we should have, what we're changing is the temperature. So that's what's changing. From the results, what is the optimum temperature for the germination of this species of grass? What's the best temperature? So we should be able to see the highest germination occurs at 27 degrees. Name one factor not already mentioned which could be kept the same to make the results valid. So we're changing temperature. What else have they given us? So we can't say temperature because that's what we're changing. They've said seed number. So what else could we possibly say? Volume of water. Now, another abiotic factor that affects organisms and distribution is natural disasters. That can decrease the biodiversity and obviously reduce the number of organisms living in a particular area. Now we're going to look at the effect of population increase, which is human impact on biodiversity. Now, the human population is growing exponentially. So this means we've got lots of needs in terms of the use of the land. However, in doing so, we're polluting the land. So human impact that affects biodiversity includes pollution, deforestation, overfishing, overhunting, sewage, and oil spills. So let's look at deforestation. Human activities such as intensive farming, in order to give us food because the population is growing, have led to huge areas of natural habitat being cleared. This clearing has led to the destruction of habitats and reduced the biodiversity in these areas. Deforestation occurs in many parts of the world today, for example the Brazilian rainforest. This results in erosion of the land and loss of fertility in the soil because it's actually the plant roots and the canopies that protect the soil. Reduction in biodiversity and changes in climate. So human activities such as intensive farming in order to improve crop yields have led to huge areas of natural habitat being cleared. And we can see that in the diagram here. Oil spills. The oil that spills in the water in the oceans causes toxic effects on the sea life and seabirds. This can result in them dying. Overfishing. Fish are being caught in very large numbers and killed for food, which means there's not enough fish left to be able to reproduce and to repopulate the area, leading to extinction. Same with overhunting. So for example, animals are being killed in large numbers for various reasons. For example, rhino horns for medicine. And again, there's not enough animals left in order for them to reproduce. Now, pollution is caused by a pollutant, and it can affect the air, the land, the fresh water, and the sea, and it can harm organisms. It damages ecosystems, damages buildings, and looks unsightly. And it comes from domestic, which is our houses, agriculture, farming, and industry. So burning fossil fuels is a real problem because that releases sulfur dioxide gas, and this mixes with water vapour and falls as acid rain. And many organisms can't survive in the acidic conditions and they die, therefore reducing biodiversity. And we can see the dead fish washed up on the shore there. Pollution results in things such as acid rain being produced from sulfur dioxide killing trees and fish, and untreated sewage being released into rivers, which causes a number of invertebrate species to decrease. So the effects of burning fossil fuels. Sulfur dioxide, and which pollutes the soil and the rivers, and organisms die when the sulfur dioxide causes acid rain. So we can see the effects of acid rain on stone, the before and after. So that gives us a good idea of what it might do to living organisms. Now we're going to look at the farmland, treating the farmland. So we're going to look at fertilisers. Fertilisers contain nitrates, which are great because they help plants grow. So nitrates are great. Nitrates contain nitrogen, which is essential for plants to make protein. And this increases crop yield, makes them grow bigger. They're used on crops on the land. However, what can happen is, if you've got water near the farmlands, the water can leach into the rivers, taking the fertiliser with it, because you can have a lot of rain, and the rain can mix with the fertilisers and enter the river systems. Now, you've got algae growing in rivers, which basically really respond to nitrates as well. They grow an awful lot more because of the fertiliser. Just as plants on land love fertiliser and increase their yield, so too do algae under the water. And this can cause an algae bloom. So the algae under the water loves the fertiliser, the nitrates allow it to make protein, and the algae grows and grows and grows, and that is an algae bloom. Now, increased growth of algae can have harmful effects on the environment. First of all, if you've got a larger amount of algae, it can block out sunlight, meaning other plants underwater can't access the light and can't photosynthesize, which means they'll die. The algae bloom eventually dies. Now, bacteria love decaying organisms, they love dead organisms, and they will be attracted to that river system because of the dead algae and consume it through aerobic respiration. Basically what they're doing is they're feeding on the dead algae and using up all the oxygen in that river system. And that means there's less oxygen for the other organisms. So if the algae blooms die, they fall to the bottom of the river or lake, and bacteria are attracted to it because it's their food. So you find millions of bacteria decomposing the dead algae, and in doing so they're using up oxygen, decreasing the biodiversity. So how do we increase nitrogen in the soil without using fertiliser? Well, we can use genetic engineering. If you remember from last year, what we did with genetic engineering was take a useful gene, a gene of interest from one species, and insert it into another. So we could create genetically modified crops that can be grown without the use of fertiliser that have a high nitrogen content in them. Or we could add manure or plough the fields. So we're going to have a look at the overuse of fertilisers today. So write notes on the polluting effects of fertilisers. How would you start? What is it plants need to grow? What do farmers put on plants to help them grow? And why? So I would start with farmers use fertilisers containing nitrogen. Now I would also say that nitrogen helps plants make proteins. Then the fertiliser can run off into nearby rivers, perhaps if it's been raining. The rain washes the fertiliser into the river. This causes algae to grow in the river, causing what's called an algae bloom, which just means lots of algae. The algae blooms block out the light for other plants. When the algae dies, bacteria are attracted to it because that's food, and they decompose the algae, they break it down, using up oxygen gas, and that means many plants and animals die because they can't get any oxygen. Now, another pollutant is pesticides, and they're used to get rid of pests such as aphids or slugs and snails which destroy crops. And pesticides can accumulate in food chains as animals eat plants and animals eat other animals. Now, if a farmer applies pesticide to the plant, the vole will come along, that's the next organism to eat the plant, and it's going to eat a lot of that plant, a lot of the grass, so it's going to end up with an awful lot of the pesticide in its system. And then we've got the owl. The owl is going to eat a lot of voles. He's not going to just be happy with one vole. So if he eats several voles with all that pesticide, the owl is going to have even more pesticide in his system. So we can see how the pesticide has accumulated as animals eat other animals in a food chain. And a food chain is just a feeding relationship between animals. So pesticides accumulate most in the organisms at the top of the food chains, which would be us human beings, because we consume more organisms in the levels below to survive. So what can we do instead of pesticides? Well, we can bring in what's called a biological control. Now, instead of putting fertiliser on plants to get rid of greenfly, we could bring in the natural predator, which is a ladybird. Or we can use genetically modified. Again, we can take a useful gene out of one organism and insert it into plants, and that useful gene might be a toxin to stop the pests eating the plants. So let's have a look at intensive farming, what that might look like. So human activities such as intensive farming in order to improve crop yield, that just means how much crop you have led to huge areas of natural habitat being cleared. This clearing has led to habitat destruction and reduced to biodiversity, so clearing land for farming. Fertilizers used in the crops leach into rivers and cause algae blooms. The algae bloom results in reduced light levels, killing aquatic plants. Bacteria are attracted to the dead plants and algae as a food source, an increase in number, and then they use up all the oxygen when they decompose the dead matter. Pesticides sprayed on crops can accumulate in the bodies of organisms over time. As they are passed along food chains, the toxicity increases and can reach lethal levels in the top predators. Thermal pollution. Water from rivers is used to cool down machines, but when the water is returned to the rivers, it's very warm. Warm water can't hold as much oxygen, and organisms need oxygen. You've got organisms living under the water, and because you've reduced the oxygen, many organisms die. And then we've got river pollution, sewage. Now, microorganisms like bacteria feed on organic waste, and we saw that when we were looking at the fertilizers. Bacteria like dead matter. They also like organic wastes. Sewage, for example, paper, waste foods. When bacteria grow in rivers, they use up the oxygen because they respire too. They take in oxygen when they respire. So let's have a look at what happens here. Here's sewage, raw sewage being dumped into a river system. That's food for bacteria. So your bacteria numbers are going to grow. Now the bacteria weren't there before. They've accumulated because of the foods. Now they multiply and use up all the oxygen, so there's none for the fish, and other organisms die, reducing biodiversity. So when you increase the level of pollution in the river, the number of microorganisms increases, the bacteria increases because it's attracted to the foods. The level of oxygen decreases because the bacteria are using it all up, and the number of other organisms surviving decreases because they needed the oxygen. So summary. High levels of organic waste in the river result in number of bacteria increasing, the level of oxygen drops, and other organisms die from a lack of oxygen. Some organisms thrive well under certain environmental conditions. We call them indicator species because their presence suggests that this environmental condition is present. So you can tell by their presence if the area is polluted. So an indicator species, you can tell by their presence if the river or the area is polluted. These are examples of indicator species. So for example, if I were to see a woodlouse or pull out a woodlouse from a river system, I can tell by its presence, because it's there, that the river is polluted. Whereas if I pull out a stonefly or mayfly nymph, I can tell by their presence that the river is not polluted because they wouldn't be there if it was polluted. So mayfly and stonefly nymphs are found in clean water rich in oxygen. So you can tell by their presence that the area is full of oxygen and is unpolluted because you would not find them in polluted areas. They can't survive. Whereas rat-tailed maggots and sludgeworms, you can tell by their presence that the area is polluted because they're found in heavily polluted water. Only animals that survive in almost no oxygen. So they thrive in habitats with very, very little oxygen. So you can tell by their presence that the area is polluted. So examples of indicator species, bloodworm and water lice, again, they are found in water which is gradually becoming less polluted, do not require much oxygen, and freshwater shrimp and caddisfly larvae. They can tolerate low levels of pollution found in water where the oxygen content is continuing to rise. Let's have a look again. So here we've got stonefly nymph. Now I can see when I pull out a stonefly nymph, that's an indicator species, and I can tell by its presence that the water there is not polluted. It's not polluted because it would not be there if it was. Stonefly nymph cannot tolerate low oxygen. Now here we've just had a raw sewage going into a river system, and I pull out a sludge worm. That's an indicator species. You can tell by its presence that the area is polluted because I know sludge worms can tolerate very low oxygen. So I know that that water is polluted. Similarly, like rat-tailed maggots, I know from its presence that the water is polluted. However, when we're coming to downstream, when we're seeing caddisfly larvae and shrimp, I know from their presence that we're getting less polluted because they can tolerate low oxygen, but not so much. You can tell by the presence whether the water is polluted. Because these organisms will only be found in particular habitats. Some of these organisms thrive on very low oxygen, and some of them will die if the oxygen is low. For example, mayfly nymph. It will die if the oxygen level is low. Bloodworm, however, thrives in low oxygen. Okay, folks, so we can see we've got a river system here. We can see we've got a sewage disposal site. Upstream of that, the water's clean. How do I know? Because as indicator species, I have mayfly and stonefly nymph that can only tolerate high oxygen. They will die if there's low oxygen. So I can tell by their presence that the water is not polluted. Whereas further downstream, I'm seeing sludge worm, bloodworm, and rat-tailed maggot. Okay, so lichen studies. Another example of indicator species are lichens. The presence or absence of a particular type of lichen tells us about the level of air pollutant, such as sulfur dioxide. So here we've got pictures of lichens here that live on the bark of trees. Now we've got different types of lichens. We've got crusty lichens. They thrive in areas high in sulfur dioxide, whereas leafy and shrubby lichens prefer areas free from sulfur dioxide. So again, we can tell by their presence whether the area is polluted. So if I see a crusty lichen, I know it's polluted. If I see a leafy lichen, I know that the area is free of sulfur dioxide. So there are sadly a large number of examples of the damage which can be caused to ecosystems by bad management. We need to look after important species which have a benefit to mankind. So examples of poor management. Stocks of certain fish species in the North Sea have almost disappeared due to overfishing. Stocks can be improved by setting limits on the number of fish caught, and the EC has done this in some cases. Introduction of foreign species can have a disastrous effect on native species because of the lack of predators. Now, an example of this is rabbits in Australia have destroyed huge areas of grassland and turned it into desert. Habitat destruction has led to a biodiversity crisis which is resulting in some species becoming extinct. And here are some examples of the species that we might not see anymore. So the control measures. We need to monitor populations to protect biodiversity. We need to make good use of genetic engineering to protect it, making sure we're taking useful genes and transferring them. And we need to use biological controls instead of pesticides, so bring in the natural predator instead of using chemicals to protect biodiversity. So here we have an example of biological control, which is basically to bring in the natural predator. And we can see the ladybird having a feast there. Here's genetically engineering. Now remember, what we're doing is we're cutting a useful gene out of one organism and we're transferring it to another organism. For example, bacteria. So for example, we find a gene in an organism that has high yield, which means high growth rates. So what if we cut that gene out and inserted it into a plasmid and modified the plasmid and then used that bacteria to infect the plant? So the plant would incorporate that particular gene and then have high yield. So remember how we do this. We take a bacteria cell and we remove the plasmid. We cut the plasmid and we insert the gene of interest, which is here. It's been removed and cut out. We insert that gene into the plasmid and then we pop the plasmid back into the bacteria cell, and we can infect the plant with bacteria, and actually the gene will make its way into the plant's nucleus. So monitoring populations. Populations are closely observed by scientists to find out what factors influence their growth or decline. There are many reasons for monitoring. To manage plant species that provide raw materials, food and medicine to make sure we don't run out. Using indicator species to determine levels of pollution and conservation of endangered species. Organisms may be removed for provision of food for man. We also have the maximum sustainable yield, which is the maximum rate of removal of individuals without affecting the future productivity of a population. Fish populations are closely monitored to determine their maximum sustainable yield. This is vital in order to prevent fish stocks crashing. Stocks of cod and herring in the British seas have crashed several times due to overfishing, and although restrictions have been put in place, fish stocks have not made a full recovery, and the EU have since passed laws that require fishing levels to stay within fixed quotas. We also want to monitor plant species that are beneficial to mankind. For example, we have cotton for clothing and poppy produces morphine for pain relief. We want to make sure we can continue to use these products. Describe 2 ways human activities are reducing biodiversity. So you could have overfishing, deforestation and overhunting. Sometimes fertilisers added to the fields can end up in fresh water, where it can impact biodiversity of the species that live there. One impact on the freshwater would be an algae bloom. Describe how this would affect the number of other organisms that live in the water and give a reason for your answer. So you might want to talk about the algae blocks the light for plants. Or you might want to say large number of bacteria feeds on dead algae and uses up the oxygen. So this would explain why the number of other organisms are going to decrease. The phrases below refer to man's influence on natural resources. Overgrazing by too many animals in one area, air pollution by sulfur dioxide caused by burning fossil fuels, and overfishing by modern fishing boats. Choose one of the phrases and describe a problem which may result from it. So for all of them, really it's biodiversity decreases, or we lose valuable resources because we lose the species. Okay, the diagram below shows the position of a food processing factory beside a river. The factory eventually accidentally released organic waste into the river. Water samples were taken from X and Y and analysed for microorganisms, so we can see the direction of flow. There's a factory, so they must have deposited the waste around here. Complete the following sentence by underlining the correct word in each bracket. Water samples from point X had microorganisms and a oxygen concentration in samples at Y. So we should have fewer microorganisms because the sewage hasn't gone in there, and if you've got fewer microorganisms, you've got higher oxygen. What does the organic waste provide for the microorganisms? Well, it provides food. Microorganisms can obtain their energy by feeding on organic waste, such as sewage. Explain why each of the following events occurred after raw sewage was accidentally released into a river. Why did the number of microorganisms increase? Why are they attracted to the sewage? What does the sewage provide for them? It is a food source. Why did the number of fish in the river decrease? Why would all the bacteria cause the fish to decrease? What's the bacteria removing? They're using up the oxygen. A group of students monitored the river using an indicator species. What is an indicator species? Remember how we start that? You can tell. You can tell by its presence if the area is polluted. Okay, so the table below refers to changes which result from the addition of organic waste into a river. The column for the concentration of organic waste has been completed for you. Tick the correct box for each column. So if the concentration of organic waste increases, what's going to happen to the number of bacteria, the microorganisms? You've got foods. Organic waste is foods. So they are going to increase. What will happen to the oxygen concentration? Decrease, because the microorganisms are using up all the oxygen. Tropical rainforests are being destroyed to clear land for farming. This leads to a reduction in the number of plant species. Explain why this might lead to the extinction of some plant species. When you cut down trees, what are organisms losing? Habitat. Fossil evidence indicates that a number of animal and plant species no longer exist. They are now extinct. Name one factor which can lead to extinction of a species that you have learned about. Well done. Overfishing. Describe one method used in the conservation of species which are in danger of extinction. Well, what we could have is nature reserves. Dead adult swans were found throughout the year. It was discovered that the use of lead weights by anglers was poisoning the swans. Other animals in the river were also affected by the lead. Suggest the effect of the lead on biodiversity of a river ecosystem and explain your answer. So the lead, what would it do to your biodiversity? It would decrease it. And why would it decrease it? What's the poison doing? Killing. State another type of pollution which could affect the biodiversity in the river. So we could have sewage, you could have thermal pollution. Now this graph is showing sampling points along a river, and we've got oxygen concentration, we have relative number of algae, and we've also got nitrate concentration. Remember, nitrate is the component of fertilizers. Okay, so let's have a wee look at what's going on here. Question if we go. Suggest one factor that may have led to an increase in algae between Q and R. Now, if we look here at the top, let's have a look at this bit here. Here we've got sewage pipe. So at that point here, there was raw sewage into the water. So between Q and R, we have a wee look. There's algae here, right? Why is the algae increasing? The algae is a plant. Can you see something else that's increasing as well? The algae are going to use to grow. So remember, fertilizers contain nitrate, which helps plants grow. So if you've put fertilizers into the water, algae is a plant, algae likes fertilizers, algae is going to grow. Explain how the presence of algae can lead to increase in oxygen. So if we look at that, we can see that our algae, as the algae is increasing, there's an increase in the oxygen. What could the algae be doing to increase the oxygen? Algae is a plant. What do we know about plants? Plants release oxygen during photosynthesis. Remember, photolysis, when you split a molecule of water into hydrogen and oxygen, and plants release the oxygen. So algae are releasing the oxygen, so the oxygen is increasing. Describe a piece of evidence from the graph that suggests that the river eventually recovers from the polluting effects of sewage. So obviously here, after your sewage went into the river, we can see that the oxygen declined. Can we see that? So you have organic waste in the river, the oxygen is declining because the bacteria are using up the oxygen. That's what's happening here. Raw organic sewage attracts bacteria. They're going to use up the oxygen. What suggests that we go back to normal again? What happens later on in the graph? The oxygen returns back to normal again. Levels of air pollution can be estimated by the presence or absence of organisms called lichens, which are indicator species. Environmental Science carried out a study on lichen species at 4 different sites and obtained the results shown in the table below. Site A has the highest level of air pollution. Using both tables, describe the evidence supporting this statement. So let's have a wee look. Site A has no shrubby. Let's look at shrubby. Shrubby is present at low levels of pollution. So we can see site A is the only one with no shrubby. Leafy, it only has 5, and leafy is present in medium conditions. But you can see site A has most crusty, and if we look at crusty, that's in areas of high pollution. So mostly crusty lichens, which indicate high pollution. And you could also suggest no shrubby, which is an indicator species for low pollution. Fertiliser added to farmland can sometimes have an impact on biodiversity in ponds and rivers close by. Explain this effect. Remember, fertilisers contain nitrate, which is great for plants, it helps them grow. However, if you have a rainfall near, and if the farm is near water, remember the fertiliser can accidentally become leached into the water systems. So remember, nitrates attract algae growth. So nitrates, obviously your fertiliser leaches into the rivers, and obviously algae bloom happens. Algae starts growing, using up the nitrates. Algae blocks out the light for aquatic plants, reducing biodiversity. Dead algae sinks to the bottom of the river and attracts bacteria. Bacteria use up all the oxygen, reducing biodiversity as the other organisms are dying. The photograph below is an aerial view of Loch Leven near Kinross in Scotland. Normally the algae population in the loch is controlled by the temperature and the limited supply of nutrients, such as nitrate in the water. Excess nutrients from fertilisers drain into the loch from surrounding farms. In warm conditions, the algae continue multiplying, and this can result in damaging algae blooms. Now, name the essential molecule which plants such as algae make using the nitrate they absorb. So nitrate is great because it helps plants grow, because nitrate is useful for making nitrogen, which is a component of protein. State why a damaging algae bloom kills aquatic plants. Blocks out the light. State why a damage, we've done that one. Explain why the dead plants and algae result in low oxygen levels that reduces the species biodiversity. What happens to the algae over time? It sinks to the bottom. So the algae attract bacteria, and the bacteria use up the oxygen. One of the advantages of intensive farming is to increase the yield of food crops, which can make them more affordable. It also has a number of disadvantages. Biological control and GM crops are methods used in farming. Choose one of these methods and explain how it is used to overcome some of these disadvantages. So let's take pesticides. So pesticides, instead of spraying chemicals, why don't we use the organism's natural predator instead of chemicals to remove it, and that's called biological control. A gardener treated the soil in the area where he planted vegetables with a chemical to increase the yield. The chemical added to the soil by the gardener contained nitrates. Name the general name for this kind of chemical. Fertiliser. Fertilisers are great because they contain nitrate. Describe the use that plants make of nitrate. How do they put, obviously nitrate is going to help them make nitrate, which is a component in protein. When the vegetables were picked and weighed, the total yield was 42 kilograms. The previous year, the total yield was 35. Calculate the percentage increase in yield. So remember how you do this calculation. It's the change, the difference between the two values, divided by the first value, the original, multiplied by 100. So you take 42 minus 35 divided by the first value, which is 35, the previous year, that's the first year, times 100, and that gives you